In the summer of 1895, on the cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, a new mansion opened its doors. It wasn't a palace, though it looked like one. It wasn't a hotel, though it could have been. It was something stranger. A summer cottage. A place meant for just 8 weeks of the year, built by one of the richest men America had ever produced. His name was Cornelius Vanderbilt II. The cost? $7 million in 1895. Adjusted for today, that's the price of a skyscraper. The mansion would be called The Breakers, and it was designed with one obsession in mind, that it would never, ever fall. Not to fire, not to time, not to ruin. While the other Vanderbilt mansions of New York would vanish, torn down, sold, or forgotten, The Breakers would survive. It still stands today, visited by hundreds of thousands each year, a monument to the age of gold and steam and ruthless ambition. The Gilded Age. The Gilded Age battlefield. In the closing decades of the 1800s, America was a country racing toward modernity, a nation being rebuilt in steel and steam. Railroads stitched vast distances into a single network. Fortunes were minted overnight, and a new elite emerged from the fires of industry. They were self-made emperors of a young empire, men whose names would soon define the Gilded Age. Astor, Carnegie, Morgan, Whitney, and above them all, Vanderbilt. But with this new wealth came a new kind of war, not fought with soldiers or steel, but with marble facades, glittering chandeliers, and ballroom invitations. The battlefield was social standing, and the prize was respectability. In a country without kings or titled nobility, these industrial magnates built their own versions of royalty, measured not by ancestry, but by architecture. Every summer, the nation's richest families descended on Newport, Rhode Island, turning its quiet coastline into the front lines of America's status war. Along the cliffs, mansions rose like monuments to ambition, colossal estates with Italian facades, French interiors, and endless servants. They called them cottages with deliberate irony. Each was larger and louder than the last, a challenge to rivals and a promise to the public. Look upon our success and know who rules this age. To win in Newport was to win in society itself. Parties were campaigns, galas were declarations of power. Every guest list was political, every ballroom a stage for influence. The Mrs. Astor dictated who was in and who was out, while newcomers with new money struggled to force open the doors of old money respectability. Into this glittering chaos stepped Cornelius Vanderbilt II, grandson of the legendary Commodore Vanderbilt, heir to the nation's greatest railroad fortune. Intelligent, serious, and fiercely driven, Cornelius was not content to be merely wealthy. He wanted permanence, legacy, and victory. And he knew exactly where that victory would be won, on the cliffs of Newport. There, overlooking the restless Atlantic, he would build not just another summer house, but the ultimate symbol of supremacy, a palace of stone and steel so magnificent that no rival could ever surpass it. This was to be his masterpiece. This was to be The Breakers, the fire that started it all. Before this palace existed, there was another. The Vanderbilts already owned a wooden mansion on the same plot of land, the original Breakers. But on a cold November morning in 1892, smoke rose from the servants' quarters. Within minutes, fire spread through the walls. The structure went up like dry straw. By noon, nothing remained, only blackened chimneys and ash drifting out to sea. When Cornelius heard the news, he didn't grieve, he rebuilt. Standing on the ruins, he vowed to raise a new house, one that could never burn, and he would make it a statement that his family's name and fortune would outlast anything, building the unbreakable mansion. For the task, Vanderbilt chose America's most respected architect, Richard Morris Hunt, the man who had designed the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. The order was impossible, a fireproof palace completed in just 2 years. Most projects of that size took 6, but Vanderbilt was a man running out of patience and time. His health was already failing, and he wanted to see his legacy while he still could. Construction began in 1893. What followed was unlike anything the United States had seen. More than 2,000 craftsmen worked in shifts. Stonecutters from Italy, plaster workers from France, painters from Spain, ships brought marble across the Atlantic, and trainloads of limestone arrived from Indiana. The mansion's skeleton was made of steel, an innovation borrowed from modern skyscrapers. The walls were brick and stone, the floors marble, every material chosen to defy fire. Inside, Alice Vanderbilt, Cornelius's wife, worked alongside French decorator Jules Allard to create interiors worthy of Versailles. She filled the rooms with imported art, hand-tooled leather, and silks from Paris. The ceilings were painted to look like clouds drifting in sunlight. Even the doorknobs were custom-cast bronze. The Breakers was not built for comfort. It was built for awe. Rooms of power, 70 rooms, each one a declaration, a statement carved in marble and gold. At its heart rose the Great Hall, a 50-foot cathedral of wealth where light poured through towering windows and danced across French limestone walls. The ceiling soared so high it seemed to touch the clouds painted above, reminding every guest that they had entered the kingdom of Cornelius Vanderbilt II. The rooms that branched from it were no less extraordinary. The music room, where Alice Vanderbilt hosted intimate concerts, gleamed not with gold, but with platinum leaf, rarer, subtler, more expensive. The billiard room shimmered in cool tones of green Italian marble, its walls veined like waves from the sea below. The morning room, Alice's favorite retreat, was bathed in soft light from the Atlantic and hung with real Renaissance paintings brought from Europe. Every space whispered the same message: power, permanence, control. For 8 glittering weeks each summer, the Breakers came alive. Servants hurried through hidden corridors, chandeliers glowed with the miracle of electric light, and laughter filled the air as the Vanderbilts entertained Newport's elite. Music echoed down the staircases, mingling with the crash of the waves beyond the terrace. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. By September, the parties stopped. The great fireplaces went cold. Furniture was shrouded in linen, shutters were drawn tight, and the servants departed, leaving behind only a small caretaker staff to guard the empty palace for the next 10 months. To ordinary people, such waste seemed unimaginable. But in Newport, waste was the ultimate proof of wealth. To own something this magnificent, to use it for only a fraction of the year, that was not carelessness. That was victory. The weight of perfection. As the last touches were finished, Cornelius paced the halls with pride. He had done it, a monument of marble and iron that no fire could take. When the Breakers opened in 1895, newspapers called it the grandest home in America. Guests stood in the Great Hall, heads tilted back, staring at the painted sky above them. They said it felt eternal, indestructible. For Cornelius Vanderbilt II, it was victory, proof that his family, once dismissed as new money, had now built something no old name could ignore. But behind the triumph, his body was failing. The man who created the unbreakable house was breaking himself. And soon, the mansion that symbolized his triumph would become the stage for his downfall. The man who built the unbreakable palace. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II looked at the finished mansion in the summer of 1895, he saw more than stone and marble. He saw a declaration. Every column, every gilded ceiling, every echoing hallway announced that the Vanderbilts were no longer just rich. They were American royalty. But behind the grandeur stood a man who had spent his entire life under pressure. Pressure to protect a fortune, to grow an empire, and to prove that new money could create something permanent. The weight of an empire. Cornelius was born in 1843 into a world already dominated by his family's name. His grandfather, Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt, had turned a Staten Island ferry business into a shipping and railroad empire worth over $100 million. A staggering fortune for the 1800s. The Commodore was legendary, ruthless, and famously unsentimental. When he died, he didn't divide his wealth evenly among his children. He gave almost all of it, about $95 million, to one son, William Henry Vanderbilt, Cornelius II's father. The logic was simple. One heir keeps the empire strong. The rest could fend for themselves. It was business Darwinism. William Henry Vanderbilt doubled the family fortune in just 8 years, but the effort consumed him. He worked himself to death at 64, collapsing in his Fifth Avenue mansion in 1885. His fortune, then $200 million, passed primarily to Cornelius II, the eldest son. Along with that inheritance came a burden that no amount of money could lighten: the responsible Vanderbilt. Unlike some of his siblings, Cornelius wasn't interested in yachts, theater, or European scandals. He was methodical, serious, and almost painfully disciplined. Where others flaunted, he calculated. He ran the New York Central Railroad, one of the most complex businesses in America. Every day brought new crises: labor strikes, government regulations, competing lines, all demanding attention. His workdays were relentless. At his desk by 8 a.m., reviewing freight rates, signing contracts, meeting bankers. He didn't drink heavily or gamble like many Gilded Age tycoons. He believed in order, efficiency, and control. To the outside world, Cornelius looked like a model industrialist. To his family, he was distant and perpetually tired. The partner. Behind the scenes. In 1867, at 24, he married Alice Claypool Gwynn, a woman from a respectable Cincinnati family. Alice was elegant but grounded, cultured yet practical, the perfect complement to her husband's stern nature. Together, they would raise 7 children and maintain several homes: their main New York mansion, a country estate on Long Island, and, eventually, the breakers in Newport. Alice was more than a hostess. She managed family affairs, social relations, and later, the preservation of the Vanderbilt legacy. When Cornelius worked himself toward exhaustion, it was Alice who reminded him to breathe, though he rarely listened. The price of wealth. Running a railroad in the 1890s was like running the circulatory system of a nation. Trains carried coal, grain, steel, passengers, everything America needed to function. When the railroad stumbled, the economy trembled. Cornelius lived with that constant responsibility. His brothers could afford leisure. Willie K. Vanderbilt raced yachts. Frederick collected art. But Cornelius shouldered the empire. He was respected, but envied. The stress aged him. By 50, his hair was white, and his health was fragile. His doctors warned him, slow down, take real vacations, leave work behind. But how could he? The empire needed constant oversight. Even in Newport, telegraph wires connected his desk to Manhattan. Each morning at the breakers, while Alice planned teas and dinners, Cornelius locked himself in his study, handling railroad business. He had built the grandest summer home in America and still couldn't enjoy it. The summer routine. Every June, the Vanderbilts arrived in Newport like royalty returning to a seasonal court. Servants already in place for weeks opened the house, polished the marble, and prepared the gardens. Guests poured in, politicians, industrialists, and members of New York's elite. The dinners were legendary: 12 courses, French chefs, orchestras performing between meals. The great hall echoed with conversation and laughter. For 8 weeks each summer, the breakers became the beating heart of the Vanderbilt dynasty. Then, by early September, everything stopped. Furniture was draped in sheets, windows shuttered. A skeleton staff of 10 caretakers remained to protect the empty palace. Cornelius returned to New York and to his empire, his mind already back on railroads and profits. The breaking point? By 1896, just a year after the breakers opened, the pressure caught up to him. On a September morning in his Fifth Avenue office, Cornelius was reading a report when his right arm went numb. Moments later, he collapsed. A stroke, massive and devastating. Doctors rushed in but could do little. Modern medicine had no cure. Cornelius survived, but the man who had commanded an empire was paralyzed and barely able to speak. Alice made a desperate decision. She would move him to Newport, perhaps the sea air. The calm of the breakers might bring recovery. They reopened the mansion in autumn, out of season, filling its silent halls with nurses and doctors instead of guests. Cornelius was wheeled through the rooms he had built, staring at the ceilings he once admired, the art he had chosen. He couldn't express it, but everyone saw it. The pain of a man who had created perfection only to lose the ability to enjoy it. A palace turned prison. For the next 3 years, the breakers became less a summer retreat and more a private hospital. Nurses pushed Cornelius's wheelchair across marble floors, while Alice sat nearby, reading to him or handling correspondence he could no longer sign. The man who had built a fortress against fire was now consumed by something no fortress could stop: time. In September 1899, 3 years after his stroke, Cornelius Vanderbilt II died at 56. He had owned the Breakers for just 4 years and had truly lived there for only one summer. At his funeral, held in New York's St. Bartholomew's Church, the pews overflowed with the powerful railroad barons, senators, bankers, and socialites. Newspapers covered every detail. Yet behind the grandeur was tragedy. The man who had built the unburnable house had burned himself out. The Widow of Marble. When the last carriage left the church and the reporters went home, Alice Vanderbilt stood alone with an impossible decision. She now owned the Breakers, a house meant for a man who was gone. She could have sold it. Many would have. But to Alice, selling the house would mean erasing her husband's dream. The mansion wasn't just a building. It was a monument to his ambition, his legacy, his name carved in stone above the entrance. So, she stayed. Every summer, she returned to Newport, opened the house, and hosted smaller, quieter gatherings. Gone were the massive balls and endless dinners. In their place came teas, music recitals, and family visits. The laughter of her children filled the same halls where her husband's wheelchair had once rolled. Alice became the guardian of the Breakers, maintaining it through decades of change, through 2 world wars, through the collapse of fortunes, through the Great Depression. She would outlive her husband by 35 years. Alice's war against time. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II died in 1899, the great house he had built stood silent on the cliffs above the Atlantic. The marble walls still shone, the electric chandeliers still worked, but the voice that had commanded its creation was gone. The people who had once filled its rooms, the governors, dukes, and industrialists, sent condolences, then moved on to the next season's parties. Newport society was already shifting. A new century was beginning, and the Gilded Age was starting to crack. Inside the vast shell of stone, one figure remained: Alice Vanderbilt, now 52 years old, recently widowed and the sole protector of her husband's masterpiece, the Widow of Newport. In the years immediately after Cornelius's death, Alice lived as if time had stopped. She refused to let the house go dark. Each June, servants opened the shutters, aired out the rooms, and placed fresh flowers in the same vases Cornelius had chosen. Dinner was served at 8. Candles were lit in the great hall. Yet the guest list was smaller, quieter. The Breakers no longer existed to impress society. It existed to keep a memory alive. Visitors who saw her then remembered her dignity. She wore black for years, her voice soft but firm. She walked the corridors daily, touching the marble columns as if they were extensions of the man she had lost. For her, the house was sacred ground, proof that the Vanderbilt name still stood unbroken. But the world beyond her walls was changing faster than she could imagine. A new century, a different world. By 1900, America had entered a new phase. Automobiles replaced horse-drawn carriages. Factories spread across the nation. New millionaires, men like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and Henry Ford, were rewriting what wealth looked like. To them, Newport's rituals felt old-fashioned, even wasteful. The younger Vanderbilts began spending their summers elsewhere, Long Island, Bar Harbor, Europe. Maintaining a 70-room mansion for a few weeks each year started to seem absurd. But Alice didn't see it that way. To her, the Breakers wasn't about fashion, it was about permanence. As long as it stood, so did her husband's name. She could afford to keep it alive, barely. The upkeep required dozens of servants, cooks, footmen, gardeners, electricians, maids. Coal had to be delivered to power the boilers. Linens were imported from France. Roofs leaked, marble cracked, storms battered the cliffside foundations. Yet each year she paid every bill. When people asked why, she gave the same quiet answer: "It is not only a house, it is my duty." Life in the mansion of memory. For the next 3 decades, Alice Vanderbilt became a living relic of the Gilded Age. She watched Newport transform from a private paradise for a few families into a public resort town filled with hotels, trolleys, and tourists, taking photographs outside the gates of her home. Inside, she maintained the rituals that defined a world already disappearing. Breakfast was served in the morning room, luncheon at 1, high tea at 4, dinner at 8. Even when she dined alone, the table was set for 12, the silver polished, the footman standing by. Her children grew up and scattered. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney became an artist and a philanthropist, founding what would later become the Whitney Museum of American Art. Cornelius III joined the army and married against her wishes. The family she had fought to preserve began to drift into modern life, leaving the old traditions behind. Still, every summer, the breakers opened, the servants returned, the curtains were drawn back, and the great house breathed again. The fall of the Gilded Age. Then came the 1920s. The country roared with jazz, cars, and speed. The sons and daughters of industrialists danced in New York speakeasies instead of Newport ballrooms. To them, marble mansions seemed heavy and old. They wanted penthouses, yachts, and freedom. And yet, amid this new energy, the breakers remained unchanged. Visitors arriving at its gates felt they were stepping into another world, a world of oil lamps and powdered faces, of servants in white gloves. Newspapers began calling it the last palace of the Gilded Age. But change was coming, whether Alice wanted it or not. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, even the richest families suffered. Stocks crashed, businesses failed, fortunes evaporated. Dozens of Newport mansions were sold for pennies or abandoned entirely. The Astors lost Beechwood. The Ulrichs closed Rosecliff. Whole neighborhoods that had once been symbols of glamour now stood empty. Through it all, Alice refused to retreat. She cut expenses, dismissed staff, and closed unused wings of the house, but she never allowed the doors to stay locked. When asked why she didn't sell, her answer was simple. "My husband built it. It will stand while I stand." The house that time forgot. By the 1930s, the Breakers was more than a home. It was a museum trapped in its own century. Its wiring, its heating, even its plumbing were relics. Yet Alice continued to live by candlelight when storms cut power, to host small dinners in rooms meant for hundreds, to walk the cliffside gardens every morning. You could see her then, a small figure in black silk moving through rooms of stone, a woman surrounded by ghosts. The laughter of her children echoed faintly in the marble halls. The portraits of her ancestors watched silently from the walls. Out on the street, cars rumbled and radios played jazz, but inside, time stood still. Visitors were rare, but those who did come never forgot the sight of her, gracious, composed, and utterly alone in the grandest house in America. A changing legacy. As the years passed, Alice began to think not just about the house's past, but about its future. She knew that one day she would be gone, and her children might not want the burden she had carried for decades. The taxes, the maintenance, the endless repairs, it would crush any ordinary fortune. Yet she also knew the Breakers could not simply vanish. It represented more than her family. It represented an era, an American dream carved into stone. Her daughter Gertrude Whitney shared that vision. An artist herself, Gertrude believed that beauty had to be preserved, not hidden. She began quietly discussing ways to protect the property when her mother's time came, perhaps as a museum or public foundation. Alice listened, but never made promises. She had spent half her life guarding the house from outsiders. The idea of strangers wandering its halls unsettled her. Still, she understood that the world she knew was ending. The final summer. By the early 1930s, Alice was in her mid-80s. Her eyesight dimmed, her steps slowed, but each June she still returned to Newport. Servants opened the house as they always had. The chandeliers were polished, the gardens trimmed, and the great iron gates unlocked. Neighbors recalled seeing her sitting by the ocean terrace in the evenings, wrapped in shawls, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. Those waves, the breakers that gave the mansion its name, were the one sound that never changed. They had been there before the Vanderbilts. They would be there long after. On April 22, 1934, Alice Vanderbilt died peacefully in her sleep in her New York home. She was 89 years old. For 35 years after her husband's death, she had protected his greatest creation and kept it alive through wars, depressions, and revolutions in taste. Her funeral was simple, elegant, private, exactly how she had lived. The house lives on. When the news reached Newport, the caretakers at the breakers lowered the flags and closed the gates. For a time, the future of the house was uncertain. Some expected it to be sold, perhaps demolished like so many other Gilded Age mansions. But the Vanderbilt legacy wasn't ready to fade. Alice's youngest daughter, Gladys Vanderbilt II, inherited the property. Married to a Hungarian count, she spent most of her time in Europe, but she understood what the breakers meant to her family and to the history of the country. She decided the house would remain intact. Servants would continue to maintain it. Furniture would stay in place. The public, eventually, would be allowed to see it. In 1948, just 14 years after Alice's death, Gladys signed an agreement with the Preservation Society of Newport County, allowing the breakers to open as a museum, while the family still occupied the upper floors. It was a revolutionary idea, a living museum, half home, half monument. Thousands came, then tens of thousands. Today, nearly 500,000 people walk through those same doors each year. A legacy of fire and stone. The breakers survived what its builders feared most. It did not burn, it did not crumble, and against all odds, it did not fade into irrelevance. It became a record of ambition, of one man's hunger to be remembered, and one woman's refusal to let that memory die. When visitors step inside today, they still feel what the Vanderbilts wanted them to feel in 1895, awe. The ceilings rise like the sky itself. The marble glows under sunlight. The ocean beyond the terrace still roars, eternal and untamed. Time has stripped away the wealth that built it, the families that filled it, the servants who polished it. Yet the breakers stands. And in the quiet of its great hall, you can almost hear a whisper in the echo of footsteps. The voice of Alice Vanderbilt, steady and calm. It will stand while I stand. The house that outlasted everyone. The breakers stands today as if time itself decided to take a step back. Perched high above the Atlantic on the cliffs of Newport, its limestone facade still catches the same golden light that once shimmered off silk gowns and polished carriages. The ocean crashes below, just as it did when the Vanderbilts stood on the terrace more than a century ago, listening to the rhythm of the waves echoing against their marble walls. From a distance, the mansion almost seems eternal, untouched by the years that have washed over it. Yet everything around it has changed. The railroad empire that built it is gone. The fortunes that once sustained it have scattered into history. But the breakers remains, proud and silent, watching as each new generation arrives to stand where giants once stood. They come from everywhere. Teachers, families, students, architects, and travelers from around the world. They walk through the gates with cameras in hand and curiosity in their hearts. Some come to study the art and architecture, others to imagine what life was like when the words Gilded Age defined an entire era. Each finds something different within its stone walls. For some, it's beauty. For others, it's melancholy. For most, it's wonder. What they discover isn't just a mansion, it's a survival story written in stone and steel. It's a story of ambition so immense it tried to make beauty eternal, of loss when that ambition consumed the people who created it, and of rebirth when their descendants turned that beauty outward and shared it with the world. Every polished surface, every echoing hallway carries the weight of that history, the triumphs and the heartbreaks, the decadence and the endurance. The breakers no longer belongs to a single family. It belongs to the nation's memory. More than a museum, it has become a monument to persistence. Proof that even in a world built on impermanence, something crafted with care and conviction can outlast its creators. Standing before it today, as the sun sinks behind the Atlantic, you realize the truth. The breakers didn't just survive the Gilded Age, it transcended it. The daughter's dilemma. After Alice Vanderbilt died in 1934, her daughters, Gladys Sechenyi and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, inherited more than a house. They inherited an obligation. The breakers was magnificent, but it was also a burden. Maintaining it required a small fortune. and the Great Depression had left even the wealthiest families counting their dollars. The sisters knew the truth. The age of marble palaces was over. America had changed. Servants were gone. Taxes were rising. The cost of heating and repairs alone could swallow entire estates. Many Newport mansions were already being sold, boarded up, or demolished. But the Breakers wasn't like any other mansion. It was the crown jewel of the Vanderbilt dynasty, a piece of national history carved in stone. To sell it would feel like erasing everything their parents had built. For years, they struggled with the question, how do you save something too expensive to keep, but too important to lose? A radical idea. By the late 1940s, Gladys Duchesne had an idea that shocked her peers. She would open the Breakers to the public. It sounded scandalous at first. Imagine letting tourists, strangers, walk through rooms that once hosted dukes and duchesses. In the high circles of New York and Newport, the very idea felt humiliating, an admission that the Vanderbilts, America's ruling family, could no longer afford their own home. But Gladys saw the truth that others refused to face. The Breakers could only survive if it belonged not to one family, but to everyone. So, in 1948, she struck an unprecedented deal with the Preservation Society of Newport County, a newly formed organization dedicated to saving Newport's historic mansions. The society would lease the house for a symbolic $1 per year, open it to visitors, and use the admission fees to pay for maintenance and restoration. In return, the Vanderbilt family could continue living on the upper floors. The mansion would remain alive, part private home, part public monument. It was a bold experiment, and no one knew if it would work. Opening the doors. That summer, for the first time in its history, the Breakers opened its great iron gates not for carriages or guests in evening gowns, but for the public. The same gates that once kept out everyone but America's richest now swung wide for anyone willing to pay $1 or $2 to step inside. At first, only a few hundred visitors came, curious locals, school children on field trips, and a handful of history lovers who had heard whispers of a Vanderbilt palace by the sea. They arrived not knowing what to expect. Some imagined an old, dusty mansion filled with forgotten furniture. Instead, they found something breathtaking. As the volunteers led them through the bronze doors, their footsteps echoed on marble floors that gleamed like mirrors. They entered the great hall, and silence fell. The ceilings soared 50 feet high, painted like a twilight sky. Enormous columns of French limestone rose around them like ancient trees. The air smelled faintly of wax and sea salt. For many, it was overwhelming, a vision of another world. Guides told them stories as they walked, of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, who built the house after his first mansion burned, of Alice Vanderbilt, who guarded it through 40 years of solitude and hardship, of the daughters who chose to open it, turning family pride into preservation. People listened in awe, realizing that this wasn't just architecture, it was endurance made visible. They craned their necks in wonder, gasping when they heard the numbers. $7 million in 1895, more than $400 million in today's money, spent on what the Vanderbilts once called a summer cottage. The irony made it even more fascinating. Word spread quickly. Newspapers began to feature photographs of the mansion's grand staircase and glittering ballrooms. By the next season, thousands were visiting each summer. The modest entrance fees covered the cost of cleaning, repairs, and security. Slowly, the great house began paying for its own survival. Gladys Vanderbilt Duchesne's gamble had worked. By sharing what her family once kept private, she ensured that the Breakers would never again face silence or abandonment. The very act of opening its doors had transformed it from a fading relic into a living legacy, a palace that now belonged to everyone. A model for America. The success of the Breakers changed everything. It proved that America's Gilded Age mansions, once symbols of excess, could be reborn as educational treasures. Other Newport families followed the Vanderbilt example. The Elms, Marble House, Rose Cliff, all opened their doors, turning the city into a living museum of architecture and ambition. By the 1960s, the Preservation Society had become one of the most respected historical organizations in the United States. The Breakers became its flagship, the mansion that showed the world what preservation could achieve. It was no longer just a Vanderbilt home. It was America's mansion. When the family finally donated full ownership in 1972, it marked the end of an era. The Vanderbilts walked away gracefully, leaving behind not an inheritance of money, but a legacy of endurance. The house that had once stood as a symbol of private power had become a monument of public pride. The Breakers and the American Dream. What makes the Breakers so captivating today isn't only its marble halls or glittering chandeliers. It's what the house represents. It stands as a mirror reflecting the story of the American dream itself, a nation constantly trying to balance wealth with meaning, luxury with purpose, and ambition with legacy. For Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the Breakers was never just a summer retreat. It was proof that a family born from hard labor, railroads, and steamships could rise to the level of Europe's oldest aristocracy. Every column, every gilded ceiling was his declaration that American success could build its own kind of nobility. Not one inherited by birth, but earned through vision and drive. For Alice Vanderbilt, the mansion became something more personal. After her husband's death, it was no longer a symbol of triumph, but a sanctuary of memory, a living monument to love, loyalty, and the life they had built together. Even as fortunes crumbled and the Gilded Age dimmed, she refused to let the light inside the Breakers go out. And for their daughters, the Breakers became a test of courage. In opening its doors to the world, they transformed privilege into preservation. What began as a fortress of exclusivity evolved into a public treasure, a home not for one family, but for history itself. Each generation of Vanderbilts lost something: power, privacy, wealth. But together, they saved everything that truly mattered. The Breakers endures not only as a mansion of stone and marble, but as a lasting reminder that even the grandest dreams can find purpose beyond a fortune, when beauty is shared instead of owned. The house that refused to die. Walk through the Breakers today, and it feels almost untouched by time. The marble floors shine beneath your feet. The chandeliers sparkle as sunlight streams through the tall windows. You can still smell the ocean air through the open doors of the terrace. Every corner tells a story. The music room, lined with platinum leaf, where Alice once hosted intimate concerts. The billiard room, with its green Cipollino marble walls, where Cornelius forebode smoking after watching his first home burn. The morning room, filled with soft light and embossed leather, where Alice drank tea and planned her summer dinners. Even the servants' quarters remain, a quiet reminder of the invisible workforce that made such luxury possible. Yet, perhaps the most powerful room of all is the Great Hall. Stand there long enough, and you can almost hear the echoes of every era, the laughter of Gilded Age parties, the footsteps of tourists, the silence of decades when one widow guarded it alone. This isn't just a house, it's a time machine made of limestone and memory. Preservation in the modern age. Today, more than 400,000 visitors step through the Breakers every year. The revenue funds not only the house's upkeep, but also the preservation of other Newport landmarks. The estate operates like a living organism, always maintained, always evolving, never forgotten. But keeping a structure like the Breakers intact is an endless challenge. A new roof can cost millions. Restoring a single fresco requires teams of experts. Even polishing the marble and repairing ancient pipes can take months of work. The Preservation Society raises funds constantly, through donations, grants, and tours, to ensure the building never falls into decay. Every visitor ticket, every guided tour, every wedding hosted on the grounds helps keep the house alive. It is, in its own way, still earning its keep, not through railroads and dividends, but through history itself. The meaning of survival. When Richard Morris Hunt designed the Breakers, he built it to defy disaster. Every wall, every beam, every inch of stone was chosen to resist fire, wind, and time. He imagined a house that nothing could destroy, a triumph of engineering and wealth. But what Hunt could never have predicted was that the Breakers' true strength wouldn't come from architecture at all. Its real foundation would be something far less tangible, but infinitely stronger: human will. It was Cornelius Vanderbilt II's will that started it, the stubborn refusal to surrender after watching his first home burn to the ground. He turned tragedy into determination, ordering a new mansion that would rise from the ashes, indestructible. Then came Alice Vanderbilt, who faced her own battles. She carried the weight of grief and widowhood, yet kept the house alive through decades of economic collapse, social change, and loneliness. For her, survival meant faithfulness. Faithfulness to a dream that had already taken so much. Later, their daughters Gladys and Gertrude made perhaps the hardest choice of all. They looked beyond pride and possession, opening the doors of their family's most private world to the public. What had once been a symbol of exclusivity became a shared legacy, preserved not by fortune, but by courage. And the story didn't end there. Today it continues through the hands and hearts of thousands. Historians restoring faded frescoes, caretakers maintaining the gardens, and visitors who walk its marble halls and leave inspired. That is the real secret of the Breakers' survival. It isn't the limestone or the steel, it's the story. The will of generations refusing to let beauty die. Legacy of the Gilded Age. The irony is striking and beautiful. The very mansion that once stood as a monument to privilege and power, built to separate the few from the many, is now open to everyone. What was once a symbol of exclusivity has become a public lesson in history. The Breakers, born from one family's desire to immortalize its wealth, has achieved that immortality in an entirely different way. Not through ownership, but through preservation. When visitors step through its bronze doors today, they don't come to admire excess. They come to understand a world that no longer exists. A world of ambition so vast, it tried to turn money into meaning and beauty into permanence. Each polished column, each carved ceiling, each echoing hall is a page from America's own story. The story of an age when fortunes were massive, tastes extravagant, and success meant showing the world what you could build. But as time passed, the lessons changed. The Breakers stopped being a display of power and became something far greater, a testament to endurance. It reminds us that even the most indulgent creations can outlive the people who built them, that beauty, once brought into existence, belongs to everyone who chooses to preserve it. The Gilded Age ended long ago, its empires dissolved and its families forgotten. Yet, the Breakers still stands, silent, dignified, and alive. It endures not as a relic of arrogance, but as proof that the pursuit of greatness, when transformed by memory and care, can leave behind something timeless. In its survival, the mansion teaches the truest legacy of all, that history, once preserved, can be shared by every generation yet to come. Epilogue: the eternal Breakers. Stand outside. The Breakers at sunset, and you'll see why Cornelius chose this place. The Atlantic crashes against the cliffs. The sky turns gold, then crimson. The sea spray drifts across the terrace, touching the same stones that workers laid in 1893. Inside, the chandeliers glow to life once more, not for dukes or bankers, but for families, students, and dreamers who come to witness what one man's vision and one woman's determination made possible. More than a century has passed since the first guests stepped through its doors, and still the house endures. It outlasted the Gilded Age, the Great Depression, and even the family that built it. The fireproof palace stands, silent and strong, proof that some dreams, once built, refuse to die. Because in America, legacy isn't just inherited, it's preserved, and that is the survival secret of the Breakers.